Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. We have a guest joining us today, Hayden Wetzel, who's going to talk about a really interesting topic. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I'm Sam Holliday, the Director of Scholarship and Operations here at the United States Capitol Historical Society, and we're so pleased that you've taken the time to join us today. We really know time is a valuable resource, and we appreciate that you spend some with us. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jane Campbell, President and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society, to kick things off.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much for being our master of the Zoom platform. We so appreciate the fact that people have tuned in. This series of telling the story of how did Capitol Hill become Capitol Hill? What's the story of the neighborhood? What's the story of the area and the Capitol has become sort of a fun thing to do on Thursday at lunch. We try to do this in a short, informal way. Most of you have gotten to enjoy Steve Livengood over the weeks, and every time he tells a new story, he does a whole new set of research, and we are never dismayed at the level of scholarship he provides, the level of knowledge. But one of the other things he has is he's got some friends. And he said, you know what, I'm going to take a break. And I want to introduce you to one of my dear friends who is going to be our panelist today. We are also everlastingly do our final promo, which is to remind you that this series is possible because of the members and donors that contribute to the United States Capitol Historical Society. We are a nonprofit organization that relies on the generous gifts of our members, and we really need your help more than ever at these trying times. So if you find an opportunity to make a little extra contribution, renew your membership, this would be a golden moment, because it brings us cool people like Hayden Wetzel. Hayden is a retired federal government employee who has done extensive research about the history of Washington, D.C., always as a volunteer with the D.C. Preservation League. And he has currently worked on about 15 landmark nominations. When something is nominated to be a landmark, there's a whole set of historical research that has to be done, and Hayden has stepped up to do that. He's published studies of the planning and construction of public parks in the Southwest Urban Renewal area, the history of Buzzard Point, and this account of the history of animal control in Washington from 1791 to about 1940, including the pound operations, the work of humane organizations, and the collection of dead animals from public spaces. This study that he's going to talk to us about grew out of the landmark nomination for the Old Pound and the Animal Rescue League shelter. So today, Hayden is going to give us a view of the district government's effort to control loose animals, farm animals from when there were farm animals in the early days, first by the police force, and then after 1871, the district pound crew, with an emphasis on what was going on in Capitol Hill. He's got stories of goats and sheep that were held by the Marines in their barracks, chickens who were despoiling Stanton Square, and the famous Battle of Lincoln Park. So we are looking forward to this wonderful conversation with Hayden. Hayden is going to share his story. We've got some graphics that depict ways in which this story was told. And as always, put your questions in the Q&A, and we will hold the questions until Hayden has finished. His talk is just about 25 or 30 minutes long. And so you'll hear us if you get something compelling that you want to ask it. When we tell him it's 15-minute warning, I may ask him a couple leading questions to move him into his final conclusion. So thank you very much for being here. Hayden, tell us about animal control.
Well, first, a little bit of short business. First, this is a small portion of the complete study, which runs about 260 pages of text and another 100 pages of appendix. If you find it interesting, I'm going to frankly tell you, you can own it. Go on to Amazon, search my name or search mangy curs, and for 15 bucks you have it. Secondly, I'm going to try to let contemporary sources carry this. Most of what you're going to hear is writings from the period. I'm just going to give you enough narration and interpretation to glue them together. But most of what you're hearing is actually written in the time that these events occurred. Thirdly, in just a minute, when I start speaking, we're going to see some illustrations. This is just a smorgasbord of graphics, which I pulled from various sources, including some photos I took myself. They do not necessarily relate to the topic today. These are pictures that were used throughout the book. It's better to look at them than it is to me, I figure. So let's get going here, shall we? Everybody here knows that for quite a while, the city of Washington existed more on paper than in reality. Up until probably the 1870s, Washington and its slightly older sister of Georgetown were much more rural than we tend to understand now. Let me look at the reminiscences of two elderly Washington residents, both writing about the turn of the 20th century and looking back to about the period, I think, of the Civil War. When we lived on 4th Street, opposite Judiciary Square, every evening we watched the cows passing along the street and over the common on the side of our house to their home in Swamp Poodle for their milking. Cows had the run of the town from Georgetown to Anacostia Creek, grazing on the pavements, breaking into front yards, disturbing the slumber of the citizens by their incessant lowing and making themselves generally obnoxious. When the chief of police submitted his annual report for 1858, he stated the greatest cause of complaint now existing is the large number of hogs and dogs running at large contrary to law. We move forward about 10 years to 1870. The newspapers are spangled with complaints from citizens. Go through almost any street in the city and you will see one or more Washington pets reclining cozily in some refreshing mud hole with a squad of geese standing guard close by. The first crop of grass has made its appearance on the K Street Park. The hogs, cows, and goats have also made their appearance, and this morning we're vigorously making the earth bare again. Not a yard, flower garden, or bit of grass can be secured from their depredations. Not a gate can be left unhinged or a door unlatched, but in walks one of these Egyptian plagues. The early laws of the city, both Georgetown and Washington, attempted to involve citizens in the capture of these animals. That is, if you owned an animal that was grazing in a park, you were fined. If you found an animal grazing in a park, you got to butcher it and sell and give half of the value to the city and keep the other half. Or you could take it to a market and sell it. But over time, this didn't work, basically. And so over time, the duty of taking up stray animals was increasingly given to the DC police. This was not a duty that they enjoyed. Citizens complained that animals continued to overrun the city. A common complaint, it would spoil their good clothes. More basic, I think, was a comment from the Evening Star. of 1868. This is the most unpleasant of all duties because the hogs generally belong to persons not able to lose them or recover them after being taken to the asylum. The asylum was the poorhouse. That's where hogs were taken to be sold. Geese were taken to the asylum to be cooked. Citizens' complaints did, with some regularity, lead to sweeps by the police of neighborhoods to make roundups. In 1859, for example, a sweep on Capitol Hill brought in 140 geese. It also, these runs also resulted in the usual number of amusing incidents. One Capitol Hill resident about the same year complained vigorously to the Ward 8 police force about animals disturbing his neighborhood. When he went out with the police, he had the embarrassment of finding his own hog taken up. He cursed and swore and committed numerous indiscretions, but in the end, he had to pay the fine. Not all citizens, by the way, took this lying down. We should remember the antics of the colored virago Mary Ann Burke, who rescued her porker from a lightweight policeman, and then, not content with this, tossed both officer and pig into the muddy sty. Wouldn't you have loved to have seen that? These occasional sweeps by the police basically did no good. There are no hogs running at large now, but of course, this is too happy a state of things to last long. And when the police were fairly out of sight, the streets began to resume their familiar look with hogs rooting, wallowing, and grunting as usual. Citizens sometimes suggested other remedies. The provost guard and other of our soldiers who desire to practice at a target might be allowed to provide the troops with a little fresh pork in this way. Seriously, I am in earnest. The problems of this period with taking up farm animals, they also took up dogs, but farm animals were the main problem in these days, resulted from two basic problems. One is that the corporation council, the city council, both of Washington and of Georgetown, had a habit of passing a series of contradictory and confusing regulations. The second was that a lot of these hogs were owned by people who had money, and they found ways to influence the corporation. In 1870, the city council, the Council for Washington, was presented with a proposal by the city's Board of Health. The Board of Health being at that time described as a mere nullity for want of power. The board decided it was in fact going to take on this problem. Senator George Edmunds summarized the situation very nicely on the Senate floor. The other day, the Board of Health voted to abolish the nuisance, and the councils abolished the Board of Health. Well, as we know, very soon after that, the Congress abolished the Corporation Council, and instead turned the whole District of Columbia into a territory with a territorial council. They also reestablished the Board of Health on a somewhat more permanent basis. The Board of Health undertook to do what the corporation authorities had failed to do and resolutely set about the abatement of the nuisance. The result was a great hubbub amongst the pig owners, thus disturbed in their vested right of free pasturage. And the board extended the time for enforcement of the order from June until January to give opportunity for killing and curing the animals. The following January, these parties immediately hurried to the council and had the board's powers rescinded. The Evening Star felt that in the end, Congress was going to have to become involved in this. After all, the members of Congress are all interested in the health of the city, and many have property here adversely affected by the nuisance. Senator Edmunds had a fear that Western men would use the annoyance of animals on the streets to try to move the capital further west. The Board of Health in 1871 tried a different tack. They took, I don't know whether to say the responsibility or really the burden of animal control away from the police force and gave it to a dedicated pound operation, which was a contractor operation. That is, they chose one contractor. He had to build his own facility. He hired his own men. He had responsibility for the whole, for the city of Washington and Georgetown. Nobody worried about the county, which was outside the city limits. Two major mistakes were made in this contractor operation. One is that the contractor was paid by the number of animals taken up, which was an invitation to steal animals. The second was in hiring a local swindler named T. Zell Hoover as the new pound master. Hoover, who has an unsavory police record here, who has been before the courts so often on charges of swindling, very soon fired as pound master because of his notoriously bad character. Hoover is certainly one of the more colorful characters that I ran across in this study. Give you an idea of how things operated. Just 2 months after he took office, Hoover's men were confronted by a lady who wanted to keep her goose rather than see him taken off. Hoover told his men to knock the cat down, tie her legs, and throw her in the wagon with the dogs. That was not the end of it, by the way. Under the next poundmaster, Wheelick, apparently he kept the same poundmen because once again, an owner complained. The poundman threw his lasso at the owner, saying he would take her too. The lady lost 2 teeth in that operation. Hoover was out of a job, and in 1872, the Board of Health made one further adjustment. They squelched the contractor pound, which had not worked, obviously. Oh, wait a minute. Forgot one other thing. Sorry. The pound men became so famous for stealing animals that some of the local hooligans got the idea. Remember, the pound men had no badge, they had no uniform, they just showed up and said they were pound men. In October of 1871, several well-known thieves, including Jerry Wormley and Tomcat Moken, and a few of their friends, went to Southwest Washington, posing as agents of the pound, and began taking up every animal they could find. The locals formed a posse and fought a pitched battle in the middle of the neighborhood. The riot sent a number of warriors to the hospital and a larger number to police court. In 1872, the pound operations were made into a straight city department under the what was now called the health officer rather than the Board of Health. The facility, which was in Foggy Bottom, was built by the city. Pound master and his pound men, there were usually 4 of them, were salaried employees. And this time, the health officer made the extremely wise choice of selecting a young German immigrant who had recently moved to Washington from Alexandria, Samuel EINSTEIN. Oh, here we are, as a matter of fact. This is Einstein in old age. Einstein basically established the Washington Pound Service. He headed it for 38 years until his death in 1911. He was a man of extraordinary integrity. He had a great deal of discretion. and he was absolutely resolute in carrying out his duties. In his selection of pound men, he took men who were very similar to him in that regard. The pound men in that period were well known for only taking up animals that were illegally out, and they actually seem to have had a fair degree of fun in doing it. They tended to stay with Einstein for years and years, by the way. Now, I'd like to take you on a pound run through Capitol Hill. And this is, in fact, a very lengthy and detailed description of a pound run that I found while I was researching, doing a little bit of extra research for this talk. In the month of July, which is when this occurred, July 1884, the pound, for reasons that I won't explain, was not taking up dogs. And so in this case, we're looking for cows. And of course, the pound crew knows where the cows tend to congregate. The description that we have in the newspapers begins with the standard, the dome of the US Capitol, shining in the sunlight. A herd of cows browsing upon the herbage of the corner lots, a few enormous umbrellas, old and faded, propped on the ground near the cows, and a wagon in the distance, drawn by a horse traveling at a lively gait, gave animation to the picture. When the wagons draw a little nearer, the umbrellas become agitated. Then they roll over or rise in the air, and under each one appears an old man or an urchin or two, who suddenly display considerable activity in collecting the cows together, after which they stand innocently and unconcernedly with hands in pockets, as if to give the impression that they have been standing that way since daylight. Perhaps 2 or 3 ragged, barefooted, but nimble youths leave the group and race rapidly over the brow of the next hill, shouting as they run, "Hog catcher, hog catcher," thereby causing much disturbance among other little colonies of umbrellas in the commons beyond. Now, we're going to travel around Capitol Hill. This is the only article I found that actually gives the number of cows found in the various neighborhoods. If you want to tote it up, you're welcome to. We're going to start actually slightly west of South Capitol Street, in the area about where James Creek housing is now. Over there, we find 45 cows. And as you've read, with a little warning, all of the supposed supervisors of the cows have made themselves look presentable. And Einstein and his crew mosey on past, because at this particular time, there's no law being slighted. We move on to Buzzard Point. Down there we find 30 cows. Einstein notes that the cows in Buzzard Point, by the way, are particularly healthy and well cared for. Buzzard Point was an agricultural area up until the 1920s. Now we're going to cross South Capitol. Remember, South Capitol wasn't paved in this time, and it dead-ended at the Anacostia River, so it wasn't anything like the barrier between East and West that it is today. Okay, in the area of what's now called South Hill East, we find 20 cows. Going a little north, we come to about where DC General is, 100 cows there. And at Lincoln Park, we're going to find 17. We're going north a little bit here to about the area of probably between the Atlas District and Stanton Square, coming up to the near northeast. On the wagon path, swinging across Maryland Avenue into Northeast Washington, and soon coming upon another region given up to cows and umbrellas. These commons were also browsed upon by goats, which as a rule were safely tied. Very soon the air rang with the old familiar cry of hog catcher. Old women could be seen hastening out and driving their geese into enclosed yards, and there seemed a general disposition to secure domestic animals from molestation. This is nothing, observed Mr. Einstein, as into an interjection of surprise at the universal shout of hog catcher. We will get it worse presently. This is swamp poodle, you know. And in fact, our last stop on this run is about where Union Station is. And at this point, we're leaving the more sedate Capitol Hill area, and we're coming to the neighborhood of Swamp Poodle, which is basically Nomot today. Swamp Poodle was a clannish, blue-collar, largely Irish neighborhood. It was the bête noire both of the pound crew and of the police. Einstein, in one of his annual reports, described as a delectable community called Swamp Poodle and described it as the goat capital of the district. Einstein hated goats. There was a shanty in the foreground, and the only human being visible was a woman who was moving about in the shanty with her skirts pinned up shockingly high, a skillet in one hand and a knife in the other. Just as the pound men were swinging off the wagon to make a dash upon the cows, the woman caught sight of the wagon and rushed out of her house, holding the skillet and knife aloft and screaming wildly. She dove rapidly around the corner of the house, displaying considerable stocking and other underwear in her expedition movement. Instantly, a dozen men appeared and rushed with frantic gesticulations among the cows. Presently, the hillsides were alive with men, women, and children hastening in all directions to the scene of action. The moment was supremely thrilling. "That's a poor widdy's cow," cried one of the women, wringing her hands. "It's the Widdy O'Houlihan's cow." Einstein was not impressed. He remarked to the reporter, he had never taken up a cow that wasn't owned by some poor widow. Now, I would like to say a few words about animals on the Capitol grounds, but why don't we take a little break here, and if we have some questions, I'll certainly be happy to take it.
Here's the question. Tell us, domestic geese, where in the hierarchy of pets did domestic geese fit?
I'm sorry, can you say it again, please?
Domestic geese, you in your book, Steve Livengood read the book and he noticed that domestic geese were identified as a serious problem, but he was wondering, where does that fit in the hierarchy?
Well, geese were the smallest animal that was taken up. Actually, we can talk about chickens, and I promised a story about chickens too. But geese were the smallest animal taken up. And they were the cheapest one to redeem. Once the pound took over the operation, the geese were not taken anymore to the asylum. They were taken to the pound, and you could go, I think you could buy them for $0.25 each. A quarter was more than it is now, but still, it was better than paying $2 for, for a larger animal.
The other question that people had is, were there wild animals like foxes and bears? I mean, what kind of?
I've never read about wild animals.
Domesticated.
The kind of thing you're talking about. For example, today, the crew that picks up dead animals from the street gets a fair number of deer every year. It's in the winter especially. I've never read about that. The largest animals were horses. And the horses were a regular nuisance up until probably the 1880s, early 1890s. At that point, the number of horses start to go down, partly because they were better taken care of by their owners, and also because you started to have automobiles. But as far as wild animals go, I saw nothing about them. And certainly in this early period.
And
there must have been such thing.
The other
They didn't make it.
animal that everybody is freaked out about these days are rats. And was there something going on with rats? Were they in the pound, or were they elsewhere? Or is that just something?
Well, they certainly weren't. Rats were a different thing. I'm sorry to tell you I didn't research rats, okay? I ran into them occasionally in doing other readings. And, but rats were handled as a nuisance to health in the same way that insects were handled. And there was an attempt to deal with pigeons and starlings. That all fell under the health officer. The pound at this point was strictly under the health officer, but they didn't deal with small things like that. They were really dealing with animals they could pick up and take to the pound.
Got it. Well, let's return. I want you to know that we have a guest from Armenia who is.
Yes, I know.
And
that's Varam.
Varam wanted to tell you that he's impressed with the depth and research of that you have done, and keep it up, and love from the other side of the Atlantic.
Varam is a longtime friend. He's not an unbiased observer, let's say. Well,
that's okay.
He went to the archives with me on several occasions and helped me do research. So he has a proprietary interest, but he's a terribly nice guy.
Well, he obviously feels the same about you. So as we move to, you wanted to talk about Capitol Hill. I'll hold some of the additional questions and we can get back to them when you talk about Capitol Hill.
Sure. Well, the Capitol, as I assume that everybody watching a Capitol Historical Society webinar knows all about the history of the Capitol. In the 1820s, the Capitol grounds were surrounded by a fence. And that was about the same time that Lafayette Park got a fence, and in fact, the mall got a fence. And for all three of those places, the reason was precisely the same: animals. Animals were coming into all of these places and eating the place up at night. The White House actually got its first barrier, which was along the southern grounds of the White House, a fence and a trench in 1801, because President Jefferson got tired of his vegetable garden being eaten every night. From that time up until about the late 19th century, I had no information until our amiable host, Steve Livengood, provided me with a story which you will remember. He not only swears this is true, but he's given me some documentation on it. Otherwise, I would say it's too good to be true. In the 1850s, as you know, the Capitol building was expanded with the two wings on either side, and then following that, the dome. Well, to do this construction project, the Capitol grounds fence had to be taken up. And as the two wings were built, the cast iron plates to assemble the dome were brought in, and they were very neatly laid out at the foot of the Capitol. Unfortunately, with the fence gone, local pigs found the Capitol grounds a nice place to come in the evening. Now, I didn't know that pigs did this. I don't have a lot of familiarity with pigs except eating them occasionally, but they like to apparently mark their territory. And they peed on the plates for the dome, to the extent that it was starting to become, well, more than annoying. It was starting to become bad for the metal. The contractor who had the job of putting the dome together complained to the superintendent of the Capitol, I think it was Meigs actually, that that they would have to either put a new fence around the metal plates, or they'd have to put the plates up on the dome and get them out of the way. Now, I am not saying that pig pee was a major factor in seeing the Capitol dome constructed. We all know about, finances and arguments and so forth, but apparently it was actually, it was a minor factor. During the late 19th century, Congress passed a series of laws prohibiting animals, and at this point we're talking dogs basically, from going into the various federal parks in the District of Columbia. Rock Creek, for example, was cordoned off starting at the southern end, and then every few years the prohibition was moved further north till eventually it hit the Maryland line. The Capitol grounds fell under this kind of prohibition. The reason for all of this was really to protect songbirds and squirrels in the parks. That was very clear. The responsibility for taking up animals on the Capitol grounds fell to the Capitol Police. The police had a sort of lasso to capture the cats and dogs Wild West fashion. And because they didn't have the kind of nets that the pound crew used, the newspaper tells us that they had to use gumshoe methods in their work. The ordinary dogs were turned over to the pound. They kept the fancier ones with the idea that the owners would come in and claim them, which in fact happened a lot. In 1904, they found a horse on the Capitol grounds, something that must have been very unusual at that time. The annual reports of the Capitol Police give the numbers of animals they took up. Most unfortunately, I have searched and searched. I can't find their annual reports. If anyone knows something, I would very much appreciate hearing about it. The report was summarized in 1910 in the newspaper when they took up 31 dogs during the year. In mucking around, the architect of the Capitol's archives, has a file called Animals. And I called up this file, and it's miscellaneous correspondence and other documents from about 1900 to 1960, all relating to animals on the Capitol grounds. You will not guess what is absolutely the dominant theme of these missives: squirrels. The public loved Capitol squirrels. Do the squirrels have a warm place to sleep in the winter? Are you putting up little squirrel boxes for them to live in? And there's actually a receipt from a pet store on 7th Street when the Capitol actually bought these little things. Do the squirrels have something to eat? Are you feeding them in the winter? For about 3 years running, a man in Indiana sent in like 12 barrels of nuts just for the squirrels to eat on the Capitol grounds. Finally, you find a very polite letter going back to the gentleman from the architect of the Capitol's office. Thank you very much. We have plenty of nuts to give the squirrels. We do not need another shipment. Institutions, and some of them rather well-known institutions, including, as I remember, the Old Soldiers' Home, requested a squirrel that was from the Capitol grounds, so they could have one of these magic squirrels on their own grounds. The only indication that I found in this file that they actually sent a squirrel was to a hospital in rural Pennsylvania. I don't know. I'm not making this up, okay? Here are two short letters, short documents that I thought were not only amusing, but also telling a little bit about the kind of work that the Capitol Police and the architect of the Capitol's office encountered during this period. The first one is from 1901. Dear Sir, I respectfully submit the following report of the boy Charles Ferguson, age 10, white, number 3010 C Street Northwest. At 1:30 this afternoon, I caught the above named boy in the act of chasing squirrels in the northeast part of the Capitol grounds. He said he thought they were wild and he was at liberty to catch or kill them if he could. I took him to the guard room where he spent 3/4 of an hour crying and promising not to do it again and to tell all the other boys the squirrels were to be left alone. Officer A.J. Swenson knew the boy's parents. He went home with him and the parents gave the boy a severe chastening, which I think ought to keep him from troubling the squirrels anymore. Yours respectfully, A.F. Barrett. and a letter going out from the superintendent's office to Mrs. J.T. Bodfish in 1918. My dear madam, I have made diligent inquiry as to the fate of your poor cat, but have not been able to find out a single thing about it. None of the officers appear to have killed such a cat. It seems to me they would have known it from your description. I'm also informed that the officers have been killing cats in the Capitol grounds when they found them pursuing any squirrels, but the officers tell me that most of the animals had been mongrel and very wild types, but they're careful about animals that appear to be very domestic. I really sympathize with you in this matter, and I'm very sorry I can give you no information. If anyone comes before me, I will be glad to send it to you. Very respectfully, Elliott Woods. And as far as the Capitol grounds go, I'm going to leave this matter with one story, which I find rather touching, actually. And it's from 1974, as a matter of fact. In that year, the grass crew found the body of a dog at the corner of, well, it was the house, the Cannon office building. He had been hit by a car. They buried the dog on the grounds where he was found, which I somehow think is very nice. Questions?
All right, we've got a pile. So we're going to start with our distinguished board member, Ken Bowling. He wants to know, Hayden, can you give us some detail on the issue, how the issue of stray animals played into the 1869 to 70 campaign to move the national capital to the West?
No, I know only what I know only the slight thing that I've found here. So that, again, that's another study.
We understand that. Well, apparently, our good historian, Ken Bowling, tells us that that was the discussion that was going on. One of the other questions people had is, how was the determination of who owned the livestock? Were there branding? You know, if someone came and said, oh, that's my pig, how did you know? How did anybody know?
Well, I think the pigs had cuts in their ears that were unique to the owner. I've never read about branding. I know that the earliest laws, even the colonial period laws that related to what now is DC or Alexandria, spoke of the larger animals as being marked by their owners. Now, once an animal was at the pound, the owner showed up, and I really have never read whether he had to demonstrate ownership. Presumably he would have to show he owned it in some way, because it was cheaper to redeem an animal that was yours rather than simply buy it at auction, because the larger animals were auctioned off periodically and you would pay a higher price. I know is that the early colonial eras always spoke of the animals as being marked by their owners. Okay. And the pigs had cuts made in the ears.
Got it. And do you know, one of our viewers asked, was the situation in Washington much different than other cities or other European capitals? Do you have any understanding of the comparison?
Washingtonians thought we were the worst city in the country. Washington was one of the last major cities in the country to have a pound. And the first pound of the modern sort that we have was established in New York in the 1850s. Ours was in 1872. And Washingtonians felt, now, I didn't go around to these, they all felt that we had a much worse situation than anyone else. By the way, internationally at that time, Istanbul was spoken of as the poster child of stray animals.
Okay. Is it true that black squirrels were a gift from Canada?
Not that I know of. The things I've read about squirrels don't distinguish between types of squirrels.
Okay.
And squirrels were sort of a side issue for me anyway, since they didn't really enter into the pound operations.
Was there any concern about
I see someone's asking about diseases from squirrels. The city had a series of rabies scares. These were pretty consistent, especially in the 20th century, up until the 1930s. And occasionally you'll read about rabid squirrels. But of course, most people were looking at rabid dogs in those days.
What about feral cats? Was that an issue as well?
When there were dogs everywhere, people didn't think so much about cats. It's the same way when you got geese, when you got pigs and horses and goats running around. The loose chickens were simply accepted, I think, as a common nuisance. Once you started to clear out these larger animals, then people started to realize they didn't like the chickens either. I don't read about cats to any real degree until kind of the late 19th century. And I think the reason is that people were more focused on dogs. The city periodically talked about the pound crew picking up cats, but every pound master resisted that because of the extraordinary difficulty of doing something and the very slight chance of being successful. You could deliver a cat to the pound and it went straight into the gas chamber. But the city had no laws relating to cats. As far as I know, still doesn't.
What about the goats on the White House lawn? Was there control of the goats on the White House lawn, or were they just running about?
The goats on the White House lawn?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I didn't read about that. There were, you might know the story, which is true, about the poundmaster taking up President Grant's cow. One day, Einstein got a message that there were a number of cows munching grass on the ellipse. And so the crew went over, picked up a bunch of cows, and when they checked the ID on the cows, they found one of them was owned by President Grant, and the other was owned by an official at Treasury named Babcock, who was apparently very unpopular. Okay, the next day, Einstein went over, Treasury told Babcock, I have your cow, you gotta pay $2. Babcock tried to pull rank on him, unsuccessfully. No one ever got their animal back from Einstein without paying the price. Einstein then walked across the street, knocked on the White House door. Down came President Grant. Told Grant, I have your cow, you owe $2. Grant paid the fee and congratulated Einstein on being a conscientious public servant. That was one of Einstein's favorite stories in later years.
I love it. Well, we're just about at our time, so I've got 3 more questions if you've got the patience for that.
Sure.
Did they pick up dead animals in the Constitution Avenue Canal?
Yes, the canal was under the control. There was an official in the city government who was responsible for the canal. Now, as everybody knows, the canal was basically a sewer. And I did find more reports than I needed to find of dead horses floating in the canal. Also the C&O Canal in Georgetown. Before the canal was built, Tiber Creek was a cesspool. And of course, famously, the James Creek Canal in Southwest. In fact, the trash haulers dumped their trash into James Creek Canal to the dismay of the military over at Fort McNair. The canal, though, was not the responsibility of the city crew that picked up the animals from the streets. It was the responsibility of the canal, whatever it's called, the canal keeper or something like that.
I see. And were there
Southwest Washington.
Was there a water trough for animals on Capitol Hill?
I'm sorry, say it again.
Was there some kind of a water trough for animals on Capitol Hill, or did they just?
Well, the Southwest waterfront, for example, animals would float up into the waterfront. but that was the responsibility of the wharf master. So there was a crew which was contracted up until 1922 to pick up dead animals from the streets and the parks. If it was in the canal, the official who was in charge of the canal had that responsibility. If it was at the wharf, it was the responsibility of the wharf master, like that.
Got it. And our final question as we come, it sort of relates back to your story about President Grant. How long did they keep the farm animals in the pound, and who paid for keeping them there?
If you picked up your animal, there was a set fee per day for how much you paid for upkeep for keeping them. They were kept. I mean, I could go through and find it for you. They were kept for about a week, I think. The only large animals that were actually killed were the diseased ones, or some that were hopelessly old. Otherwise, they were held for a certain amount of time, and periodically, one of the pound master's many duties was to hold an auction, and they were sold.
Got it. Well, Hayden, this has been fascinating. It is always a thrill to me to learn something I didn't know and to see the real depth of research that people have with their passion about history. And this is a great story. You're a good storyteller. And thank you very much for sharing your time. And for all of those of you who joined us, thank you for tuning in. We hope that you will be with us next week for Steve again, Lunch Bites with Steve, and the following Tuesday for Colleen Shogan. Take care and thank you very much.